My name is Naomi, and I am 33 years old. At my own wedding reception, I watched my older brother slip a powdered substance into my champagne glass. I did not scream. I did not panic. I simply waited for him to look away, and I switched our drinks. Minutes later, he raised his tainted glass, flashed me a smug grin, and delivered a toast, promising that a massive surprise was coming for me very soon. I smiled back, raised my clean glass, and watched him swallow every last drop. Before I reveal the absolute chaos that unfolded exactly 15 minutes later, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family member who thought they were untouchable. The air inside the grand ballroom of the Hudson Valley estate was thick with the scent of imported white roses and expensive perfume. My parents, Richard and Patricia, had spared absolutely no expense for this event. They invited 300 guests, mostly their wealthy business associates, country club acquaintances, and local politicians. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in silk linens. Waiters in pristine white jackets glided silently across the marble floor, carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage wine. To any outsider, this looked like the perfect celebration of love and family unity. But beneath the surface of all this breathtaking luxury, a sinister current of hostility was pulling us under. My family had operated like a ruthless corporation, and my brother Trent was the undisputed golden child. At 37, he was the chief executive officer of our family business, a man who wore custom-tailored Italian suits to hide the deep rot inside his character. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on. I, on the other hand, was the family disappointment despite building a highly successful career as a forensic accountant for a massive corporate firm. My parents hated my independence, and they especially hated the man I was marrying. My husband, David, was a brilliant African-American corporate lawyer and a former federal prosecutor. He was self-made sharp and intimidatingly powerful. My parents and brother despised him because they could not control him, and they despised me for choosing a life completely outside their toxic sphere of influence. The reception was in full swing when the moment of truth arrived. David had stepped away to speak with his parents, leaving me momentarily alone at the head table. Trent approached me with 2 glasses of champagne. He moved with a practiced swagger, clearly intoxicated by his own perceived cleverness. He set the glasses down and pointed toward the massive floral arch near the entrance, claiming a guest was trying to get my attention. It was a lazy distraction, but I played along. I turned my head just enough to satisfy him, but kept my eyes fixed on the reflection of the silver serving platter directly in front of me. Clear as day, I saw his hand hover over my glass. A white packet materialized between his fingers, and a fine powder vanished into the bubbling liquid. He stirred it quickly with a cocktail straw, his face twisted into a look of absolute malice. I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but my forensic training kicked in. Panic is the enemy of logic. When Trent turned around to greet a passing waiter, I reached over and seamlessly swapped the placement of our glasses. The movement took less than 2 seconds. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained perfectly steady. Trent turned back to me, oblivious to the fact that his trap was now set for himself. He picked up the poisoned glass, his confidence radiating like toxic heat. The band stopped playing, and Trent tapped a silver spoon against the rim of his glass. The sharp, ringing sound commanded the attention of the entire ballroom. Conversations halted, and 300 faces turned toward the head table. Trent stood tall, projecting the image of a loving, supportive older brother. He cleared his throat and began his speech. He spoke about our childhood weaving elaborate lies, about how close we used to be. He praised my parents for their generosity in hosting this magnificent event, subtly reminding everyone of their wealth and status. Then he turned to me, his eyes locked onto mine, completely devoid of warmth. He raised his glass high in the air. To my little sister Naomi, he announced, his voice echoing through the silent room. May your new life bring you exactly what you deserve. And congratulations, because my special surprise for you is coming very soon. Drink up. I maintained a perfectly serene expression. Thank you, Trent, I replied smoothly. I am looking forward to it. I lifted my clean champagne flute to my lips and took a deliberate sip. Trent mirrored my action, eagerly swallowing a large mouthful of his heavily tainted drink. A sudden rush of pure adrenaline flooded my veins as I watched the golden liquid disappear down his throat. He set the empty glass down upon the table with a highly satisfied thud, entirely unaware that he had just swallowed his own poison. David returned to his seat beside me just as Trent walked back to his table. David glanced at my face immediately, sensing the sudden shift in my energy. What happened? He murmured, his sharp prosecutor instincts immediately on high alert as he surveyed the massive crowd. I leaned close to his ear, my voice barely a whisper against the background music that had just resumed playing. Start the clock, I told him calmly. We have exactly 15 minutes until my brother puts on the greatest show of his entire life. David did not ask any pointless questions. He simply nodded, his dark eyes scanning the room, completely ready for the incoming storm. The countdown had officially begun. The first 5 minutes passed with agonizing slowness. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, cutting a piece of steak I had no intention of eating. Across the room, Trent held court at a table full of wealthy friends, laughing loudly and draining a second glass of champagne. He thought he was minutes away from watching me collapse into a humiliating mess. My parents, Richard and Patricia, suddenly materialized at the edge of the head table. They moved with that predatory grace peculiar to generational wealth. My mother wore a silver gown, her smile fixed and entirely devoid of genuine warmth. My father stood rigidly beside her, hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the ballroom. They did not come to congratulate us. They came to mark their territory. Patricia leaned down, her heavy diamond necklace brushing against my shoulder. The fragrance of her expensive perfume was suffocating. Have you noticed how loud your new in-laws are being, Naomi? She murmured, her tone dripping with polite venom she had perfected over decades. She gestured toward the table where David's family sat. His father was a retired federal judge, and his mother was the chief of surgery at a Chicago hospital. They were sharing a joyful, dignified celebration. But to my parents, they were intruders. They are a bit too expressive for this venue, Richard added, adjusting his tie. You would think people of their supposed professional standing would understand the decorum required at an estate event. But I suppose one cannot buy class. I felt David shift beside me. His jaw tightened, a sign of the immense restraint he was exercising. He knew exactly what my parents were doing. It was the same insidious racism they had displayed since I introduced him. They never used slurs. They used polite insults, questioning credentials, commenting on volume, or feigning surprise at his family's speech. My husband is a master of emotional control, but I did not need him to fight this battle. I looked at my father. David's father spent 30 years on the federal bench, Dad. I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. I think he understands decorum far better than anyone in this room, especially considering he sentenced men for the exact type of corporate tax evasion your friends treat like a competitive sport. Richard narrowed his eyes, the fake smile vanishing from his face. Do not use that tone with me, Naomi. We paid a fortune for this wedding to ensure our associates were properly entertained. You should be showing some gratitude instead of defending people who clearly do not fit in here. You paid for this wedding because you wanted a photo opportunity for your corporate newsletter, I replied smoothly. Do not pretend this was a gift to me. Patricia let out a sharp sigh, placing a hand over her chest as if I had struck her. You have always been so utterly ungrateful. You sit there acting superior with your accounting job while your brother carries the family legacy on his shoulders. She leaned in closer, her face mere inches from mine. Her fingers dug painfully into my shoulder. You do not belong at this wedding, Naomi, she hissed, her voice a toxic whisper meant only for my ears. You have never belonged in our world. You embarrass us. Do you have any idea what Trent sacrificed to make today happen for you? He gave up so much to ensure you had a beautiful day despite your constant defiance. You owe your brother everything. I glanced across the ballroom. The countdown in my head was hitting the 10-minute mark. Over by the ice sculpture, Trent was no longer laughing. He was standing rigidly, tugging at the collar of his custom suit. A thick sheen of sweat had broken out across his forehead. He pushed a waiter aside to grab a glass of ice water, downing it in one gulp. The drug was breaching his system. I turned my attention back to my mother, offering her a smile so cold it made her recoil. "I am well aware of what Trent sacrificed for today, Mother," I told her. "In fact, I think everyone in this room is about to see what kind of man my brother truly is." Patricia frowned, confused by my absolute lack of intimidation. She opened her mouth to deliver another insult, but my father interrupted. He had noticed David watching them with the calculating, predatory gaze of a seasoned prosecutor building a case. "Leave it," Patricia Richard muttered, placing a hand on her arm. "Let her sit here with her new family. We need to go speak with the senator anyway. Trent is supposed to introduce us." They turned and walked away, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb waiting for them across the dance floor. David leaned closer to me, his shoulder brushing mine. His voice was a deep, steady anchor in the middle of the escalating tension. "Your mother has no idea she is standing on a landmine." He noted his eyes tracking Richard and Patricia as they made their way through the sea of guests. I picked up my fork and finally took a bite of my dinner. "She is about to find out," I replied. I checked my watch to see exactly how much time remained. 12 minutes had slowly passed. The initial stage of the narcotic was clearly taking a heavy toll on my brother. Trent was pacing erratically near the exit doors, running his hands frantically through his hair. He looked like a man trying to escape a burning building that only he could see. He stumbled backward, knocking over a tall floral arrangement. The heavy crystal vase shattered against the marble floor with a deafening crash. The sharp noise acted like a starting gun. Trent let out a sudden guttural scream that silenced the entire ballroom. The polite chatter died instantly. The string quartet stopped playing their song mid-note. The 15 minutes were up. Trent tore at his bespoke suit jacket, popping buttons onto the polished marble floor. He swatted wildly at the air around his head, battling invisible swarms of insects only he could see. "Get them off me!" he shrieked, his voice cracking in absolute terror. Guests gasped and backed away in horror. Richard and Patricia froze, their perfect facade shattering in real time. Patricia dropped her champagne flute, the crystal shattering against the ground. Trent lunged towards the head table but tripped over a chair, crashing heavily into a towering, tiered wedding cake. White frosting and spun sugar exploded across his expensive trousers. He did not seem to notice. He scrambled backward like a feral animal, pointing a trembling finger at our father. "You let them out. You opened the vault. They are crawling out of the walls," he bellowed, spit flying from his lips. The influential senators, the corporate partners, and the country club elites all watched in stunned, morbid fascination. This was not a man who had simply had too much to drink. This was a man experiencing a catastrophic psychological break right in front of their eyes. Patricia rushed forward, trying to grab his flailing arms, but he shoved her violently into a table of expensive hors d'oeuvres. "Do not touch me, you snake!" he roared, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. I watched my father frantically wave for the event coordinators to open the side exits and clear the room. He desperately wanted to salvage whatever dignity remained and hide his golden child from the public eye. But David was already one step ahead. He raised his right hand and gave a sharp, subtle hand signal. Positioned discreetly around the perimeter, David's private security team moved in perfect synchronization. They stepped in front of the heavy mahogany exit doors and locked them tight. Nobody was leaving. My parents were going to sit in this room and watch their precious son burn their reputation to the ground. As Trent writhed on the floor, covered in ruined cake and screaming about imaginary spiders, my mind drifted back to the moment this entire trap was set. Exactly 48 hours before the wedding, I sat in my parents' pristine living room, realizing exactly how far they were willing to go to destroy me. 2 days prior, Richard and Patricia had summoned me to the family estate under the guise of finalizing last-minute wedding logistics. Trent was there, sipping expensive scotch, looking entirely too pleased with himself. The atmosphere in the room was suffocatingly tense, masked by their usual fake smiles. My father slid a thick stack of legal documents across the glass coffee table. Just some standard family trust paperwork, Richard had said casually, not making eye contact. Your mother and I are updating our estate planning before you officially marry David. We need your signature on these releases today. As a forensic accountant, my core instinct is to never sign anything without reading the fine print. I picked up the heavy linen paper and began scanning the paragraphs. It was not a simple estate release. Buried on the third page, completely out of context for a financial update, was a medical power of attorney and a declaration of incapacity contingency. The clause was incredibly specific. It stated that if I were to suffer a sudden psychological break, mental health crisis, or unexplained cognitive decline, Trent would be granted immediate temporary medical and legal guardianship over me. Furthermore, it contained a highly unusual financial rider, granting him temporary authority to liquidate my shares in the family corporation to cover my potential long-term medical care. I felt my blood run cold. Why am I signing a medical power of attorney, handing my healthcare decisions to Trent? I asked, dropping the pen back onto the table. I am marrying David in 2 days. He will be my next of kin, and he is a lawyer. He handles all my legal matters. Patricia sighed dramatically, rubbing her temples as if I were being entirely unreasonable. Naomi, do not be so paranoid. It is a standard protective measure. You have a highly stressful job, and wedding planning has clearly made you anxious. We just want to ensure your brother can step in if you have one of your little episodes. She was trying to plant the seed. She wanted to establish a narrative right then and there that I was unstable and prone to mental breakdowns. Trent leaned forward, feigning brotherly concern. David is too busy with his corporate law cases, sis. We are just looking out for your well-being. Just sign the paper so we can get back to celebrating your big week. The trap was so blatant to a trained auditor. They needed that signature. They needed it desperately before I legally bound my assets to a former federal prosecutor who would never let them near my bank accounts. I knew if I flatly refused, they would find another, perhaps more violent way to force my hand before the wedding. I needed them to believe they had won. I needed them to proceed with whatever horrific plan required this document, so I could catch them in the act. So I picked up the pen, forged a signature that looked close enough to mine, but would fail any basic handwriting analysis in a court of law, and handed the packet back to my father. There, I had said softly, maintaining a perfectly compliant expression as I handed the pen back to him. All taken care of. I left their sprawling estate that afternoon feeling a profound sense of dread, completely unaware that Trent had already visited the dark web. I did not yet know he had purchased the exact chemical substance needed to trigger my supposed psychological break. But standing here now, watching him scream on the ballroom floor, I knew my forged signature was the absolute best decision I ever made to protect my entire future and my life. Leaving the estate, my fake compliance melted into a calculating fury. I drove straight to our penthouse. The medical power of attorney was not merely an insult. It was a highly specific, legally binding weapon. Financial liquidation clauses mean desperate panic. My parents were wealthy, but their wealth was tied up in assets, real estate, and the family corporation. If Trent needed to forcibly sell my shares, it meant he had created a deficit so massive that conventional loans or asset leveraging could not save him. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went. I booted my workstation. Forensic accounting is not just about balancing ledgers. It is the art of hunting ghosts in the machine. It is finding the negative space where money used to be. Years ago, my father foolishly had me review their corporate security protocols. He wanted free labor. I gave it to him, but I also left a highly encrypted, virtually undetectable backdoor in their server architecture. I never intended to use it, keeping it only as a failsafe against my family's notoriously shady business practices. That failsafe was about to pay off. Routing my connection through offshore networks, I ensured my footprint bounced internationally before touching their servers. I initiated the breach protocol. The system firewalls were exactly as outdated as I remembered. Trent had likely slashed the cybersecurity budget to fund his own lavish lifestyle. I easily bypassed the authentication gates, gaining full administrative access to the central financial database. I downloaded a complete mirror image of their financial records for the past 5 years, isolating the files on an encrypted drive to prevent tracking software from catching my intrusion. I began dissecting the numbers. The primary ledgers looked perfectly pristine. The profit and loss statements were balanced down to the cent, showing a healthy, thriving corporation. But superficial perfection is a red flag. I bypassed the main accounts and dug straight into the vendor payment histories and the subsidiary operational costs. That is where corporate thieves make their mistakes. They create an illusion of legitimate business expenses to siphon cash right out the back door. I deployed a data analysis algorithm I had custom designed for my corporate clients, setting the parameters to flag recurring payments to unverified limited liability companies. The screen lit up with red alerts. A pattern emerged immediately. Over the past 3 years, the corporation had been funneling massive monthly payments to 5 different consulting firms and logistics vendors. I cross-referenced their tax identification numbers. They were phantom entities. They had no physical addresses, no payroll records, and no actual clients other than my family's corporation. Trent had set up a network of shell companies to bleed the business dry. I traced the diverted funds through a labyrinth of wire transfers, watching the money bounce through secondary accounts before finally consolidating. The destination was the shared family trust fund. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The trust fund was supposed to be untouchable, a generational wealth reserve meant to protect the core corporation and provide for both Trent and me. I accessed the trust's private ledgers, my fingers flying across the keyboard. The numbers on the screen confirmed my darkest suspicions. The trust was entirely hollowed out. Trent had embezzled exactly $8 million. He had systematically drained the trust to finance extreme luxury and staggering incompetence. He had stolen my half of the inheritance, and he had stolen the corporation's ultimate safety net. The phantom vendors were his desperate attempt to slowly replenish the stolen funds using company revenue, but the business was not generating enough profit to cover an $8 million black hole. Trent was arrogant, but he was also incredibly sloppy. He had left a digital trail so wide a first-year accounting student could have found it. But arrogance did not explain the sudden frantic rush to have me sign a medical power of attorney 2 days before my wedding. Embezzlement of this magnitude could stay hidden for years if the internal auditors were paid to look the other way. Something had triggered this immediate panic. Something had forced Trent to seek a massive instant payout by liquidating my personal shares. I shifted my focus away from the financial ledgers and hacked directly into Trent's executive email server. I bypassed his laughably weak password security and searched his inbox for high-priority flagged messages. Buried beneath dozens of unread emails from furious contractors, I found it. A digital correspondence marked with the official seal of the Internal Revenue Service. It was a formal notice of an impending comprehensive federal audit. The IRS had flagged anomalies in the corporate tax returns and was sending a team of federal agents to physically inspect the company books in exactly 14 days. The entire puzzle locked into place with terrifying clarity. When the IRS agents arrived, they would immediately demand to see the trust fund verification. They would find the $8 million deficit. Trent was facing decades in federal prison for corporate fraud and tax evasion. He needed $8 million immediately to inject back into the trust before the auditors arrived. His only available asset large enough to cover that exact amount was my portfolio of shares. If I were perfectly healthy, I would never sell. But if I suffered a sudden catastrophic psychological break at my own wedding, Trent could activate the medical power of attorney. He needed to create a scenario where I was deemed entirely hopelessly unstable. He could declare me mentally incapacitated, seize legal control of my assets, and forcibly liquidate my shares to save himself from federal prison. I stared at the glowing monitors, the sheer cruelty of his plan washing over me. He was willing to destroy my mind and erase my freedom just to cover his own crimes. I pulled out my phone and dialed David. It was time to show a federal prosecutor exactly what kind of monsters we were dealing with. David walked through our penthouse door 20 minutes after I called him. He shed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, his sharp eyes locking onto the glowing monitors on my dining table. I wasted no time with pleasantries. I laid out the financial slaughter I just uncovered. I showed him the phantom vendor networks, the $8 million black hole in the family trust, and the impending Internal Revenue Service audit scheduled for exactly 14 days from now. David listened with the terrifying stillness that made him a lethal presence in a courtroom. He absorbed the sheer magnitude of Trent's incompetence and desperation without a single change in his expression. When I finished outlining the medical power of attorney and Trent's obvious need to liquidate my shares, David slowly stepped up to my workstation. His mind was already moving 3 steps ahead of my financial audit. If Trent plans to trigger a medical emergency to activate that clause, he needs a catalyst. David stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble. Your brother is not smart enough to orchestrate a psychological break using manipulation alone. He needs a biological weapon, a chemical agent. David pulled his encrypted laptop from his briefcase. While he had transitioned into high-stakes corporate law, he spent the better part of a decade as a federal prosecutor, dismantling cybercrime syndicates and financial fraud rings. He still possessed deep access to highly specialized digital tracking tools and maintained a formidable network of reliable federal contacts. He connected to a secure virtual private network and actively began hunting my brother through the digital underworld. Your older brother is incredibly sloppy with money, David murmured, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Let us see how sloppy he is with his browser history. David did not bother looking at Trent's standard email or bank accounts. He went straight for the encrypted router logs connected to Trent's private office network. Using an exploit he had learned from his days working alongside federal cyber task forces, David breached the firewall shielding Trent's personal devices. Within 30 minutes, he found a massive anomaly. Trent had installed a secondary anonymous browser and routed a significant cryptocurrency transfer through a digital tumbler just 3 weeks ago. The tumbler was designed to scramble the origin of the funds, making the transaction untraceable to standard law enforcement. But David was not standard law enforcement. He deployed a tracking script that followed the digital breadcrumbs right to the edge of the dark web. He isolated the exact destination wallet. It belonged to an illicit online marketplace known for moving high-grade pharmaceuticals and unregulated chemical compounds. Trent spent $20,000 in untraceable digital currency. David reached out to a trusted contact, an active federal cybercrime investigator who owed him a career-defining favor. They exchanged a brief, heavily encrypted sequence of messages. 10 minutes later, David received a secure data packet containing the decrypted transaction ledger for that specific dark web vendor. We scanned the digital receipt. The purchase was for a highly concentrated synthetic compound. It was a military-grade narcotic designed to induce severe immediate psychosis. The drug triggered terrifying visual and auditory hallucinations, extreme paranoia, and complete temporary amnesia. Anyone who ingested it would appear to be suffering from a catastrophic spontaneous schizophrenic break. It left the system within 24 hours, making it impossible to detect in standard hospital toxicology screens unless the doctors knew exactly what specific chemical marker to look for. The sheer depravity of the scheme crystallized in the air between us. Trent was not just trying to steal my money. He was planning to publicly humiliate and medically destroy me. David leaned back in his chair, his jaw set in a rigid line of absolute fury. The entire narrative clicked into place. The upcoming wedding was not just a convenient venue. It was the perfect stage. Trent needed an audience. He needed 300 of the most influential people in our social and professional circles to witness my supposed mental collapse. He needed politicians, corporate partners, and wealthy investors to see me screaming at invisible demons. Once I was hauled away in an ambulance, raving and completely disconnected from reality, Richard and Patricia would play the role of devastated parents. Trent would step up as the responsible older brother. He would present the forged medical power of attorney to a judge, citing my spectacular public breakdown as undeniable proof of my sudden incapacity. The court would grant him immediate emergency guardianship. Within 48 hours, he would have legal authority to liquidate my shares in the family corporation. He would dump the $8 million back into the trust fund just before the Internal Revenue Service auditors knocked on his door. He would avoid federal prison, and I would be locked inside a psychiatric facility stripped of my assets and my credibility. I stared at the chemical breakdown of the narcotic on David's screen. The betrayal was so absolute, so thoroughly calculated that it bypassed my emotions entirely and struck a core of pure ice inside my chest. They were willing to sacrifice my sanity to save their golden child. David closed his laptop with a sharp, decisive snap. He looked at me, his dark eyes burning with a protective, calculating intensity. "Your brother thinks he is playing a game of checkers," David said, his voice deadly smooth. "He has no idea he just challenged a prosecutor to a game of chess." We sat in the quiet penthouse and constructed a counteroffensive designed not just to stop Trent, but to annihilate the entire corrupt foundation of my family's empire. We would not call the police now. An arrest today would only help Trent hire defense lawyers to bury the evidence and delay the trial. We needed him to commit the crime. We needed him to act with absolute certainty that he had won. We decided to let Trent walk directly into his own trap at the wedding reception. "If we alert the authorities tonight," David explained, pacing the length of our penthouse living room, "his defense attorneys will claim his computer was hacked, or that the cryptocurrency transfer was a corporate expense misunderstood by investigators. He has the financial backing of the entire family corporation to drag out a federal indictment for years. We do not just need digital footprints. We need the physical execution of the crime." I watched him map out the legal battlefield, his strategic mind operating with terrifying precision. He has to bring the narcotic to the venue, I reasoned, tracing the logical progression. He has to physically possess the compound, approach my glass, and deposit the drug. If we stop him before he acts, he is just a man who bought a suspicious substance online. If we let him poison the glass and we secure that exact glass as evidence, we have him for attempted aggravated assault with a chemical agent. David stopped pacing and turned to me, his expression resolute. "Exactly. We let him commit the felony in a room full of 300 witnesses, but we also need to ensure you never ingest a single drop of that poison. You will need to switch the glasses." We spent the next few hours meticulously refining our counteroffensive. David contacted a highly discreet elite private security firm staffed entirely by former federal agents and military veterans. He did not hire them for crowd control. He hired them for evidence preservation and containment. Their primary objective would be to secure the tainted champagne flute immediately after the toast chain of custody style and transport it directly to an independent toxicology laboratory for immediate chemical analysis. Meanwhile, I compiled the ultimate financial kill shot. I assembled a comprehensive dossier detailing Trent's $8 million embezzlement, the phantom vendor network, the depleted family trust, and the impending Internal Revenue Service audit. I encrypted the entire file and scheduled it to automatically blast to the board of directors, the family lawyers, and the federal investigators the moment I gave the signal. We were not just going to stop his plan. We were going to obliterate his entire existence. The morning of the wedding arrived with a deceptive calm. I sat in the bridal suite, allowing makeup artists and hairstylists to fuss over me. Patricia hovered in the background, offering passive-aggressive critiques about my dress and my hair. I played my part flawlessly. I acted slightly nervous, suitably compliant, and entirely oblivious to the fact that my mother was actively participating in a conspiracy to destroy my sanity. Every time she smiled at me, I saw the absolute rot underneath her expensive facade. David and I exchanged a single knowing look at the altar, as I recited my vows, promising to stand by this brilliant, fiercely protective man I knew I had already won. The reception began exactly as scheduled. The champagne flowed, the string quartet played, and Trent circled the head table like a vulture waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He thought he was the apex predator in the room. He had no idea he was already caught in a steel trap. Which brought us back to the present moment standing in the center of the opulent ballroom. The grand mahogany doors were securely locked by David's security team. No one was leaving this room. The polite society masquerade was officially over. Trent thrashed on the marble floor, completely consumed by the military-grade hallucinogen he had intended for me. The cake he had destroyed coated his custom suit in sticky white frosting. He clawed furiously at his own face, screaming about insects burrowing under his skin. His screams echoed off the crystal chandeliers, a horrifying soundtrack to the destruction of my parents' perfect legacy. Richard and Patricia were paralyzed by a combination of shock and rising panic. My father took a frantic step toward the locked exit doors, demanding that the security guards let them out. The guards remained perfectly still, their expressions impassive, arms crossed firmly over their chests. They answered only to David. "Open these doors immediately!" Richard bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "My son is having a severe allergic reaction. We need an ambulance right now." I stood perfectly still, watching my father lie to protect the golden child. He knew exactly what was happening to Trent. He knew this was not an allergy. He recognized the symptoms of the drug because he had likely researched it right alongside my brother. The sheer hypocrisy of his panic was staggering. He was perfectly willing to watch me suffer this exact terrifying fate, but seeing his precious heir reduced to a screaming, thrashing mess broke his composure entirely. "He does not need an ambulance for an allergy, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us. "He needs a psychiatric hold. Or perhaps you should just activate the medical power of attorney I signed 2 days ago." That was the plan, was it not? Patricia whipped her head around to stare at me, the blood completely draining from her face. Her eyes darted from my perfectly calm expression to the empty champagne flute resting on the head table, and finally down to Trent, who was currently curled into a fetal position, sobbing hysterically about the walls closing in. The realization hit her with the force of a freight train. She stumbled back, clutching her chest, entirely unable to comprehend that her brilliant, flawless son had fallen victim to the exact sinister trap he had designed for me. The absolute disbelief etched across her features was a picture of perfect justice. "You?" Patricia gasped, her voice trembling as she pointed a manicured finger at me. "What did you do to him?" "I simply let Trent toast to my future," I replied very slowly, crossing my arms. "It seems he could not handle his very own medicine today." The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance cast a chaotic glow against the pristine white marble of the estate as paramedics hauled Trent away. The transition from high society elegance to the sterile, harsh fluorescent glare of the emergency room took less than 20 minutes. The air in the trauma ward smelled sharply of antiseptic and panic. We stood behind the reinforced glass of Observation Room 4, watching the medical staff battle my brother's drug-induced psychosis. Trent was strapped tightly to a stainless steel gurney, his bespoke suit ruined and discarded on the floor. He thrashed violently against the leather restraints, his eyes rolling back into his skull. He shrieked about shadows eating his flesh, his voice reduced to a ragged primal howl. 2 orderlies had to hold his shoulders down, while an emergency physician forced a thick charcoal tube down his throat to pump his stomach. The monitor next to his bed shrieked with elevated heart rate alarms. Richard and Patricia paced the waiting area like caged predators. Their country club refinement had completely evaporated, replaced by a frantic, ugly desperation. They refused to accept that their golden child was the architect of his own destruction. They needed a scapegoat. They needed someone to absorb the blame for the catastrophic humiliation they had just endured. Their eyes darted toward me, but they quickly bypassed their daughter to lock onto the man standing steadfastly by my side. David stood with his arms crossed over his tailored tuxedo jacket. He watched the medical procedure with the cold, analytical detachment of a man who had spent years evaluating crime scenes. His absolute calm seemed to infuriate my parents even more. Patricia marched across the linoleum floor, her silver gown stained with a bizarre mixture of spilled champagne and ruined wedding cake. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my husband. You did this to him? Patricia hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. You and your street tactics. You could not stand that Trent was better than you. You could not stand that my son comes from a pedigree you will never possess. You slipped something into his drink because you want to tear down everything we built. Richard stepped up beside her, his face a mask of aggressive, racially coded hostility. We know how your type operates, he snarled, dropping any pretense of polite society manners. You think you can hustle your way into our family and take out the primary heir. You think you can use your aggressive street behavior to intimidate us. I am going to have you locked up for this. I will call the police commissioner directly. I will make sure a thug like you never sees the inside of a courtroom again unless you are wearing an orange jumpsuit. I stepped forward, furious at their blatant racism, ready to tear them apart. But David gently placed a hand on my wrist, stopping me. He did not need me to defend him. He thrived in this exact environment. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and my parents. He towered over Richard, but he did not raise his voice. He did not lose his temper. He simply dismantled them. Let us be exceptionally clear about the legal reality of your current situation. Richard, David began, his voice a smooth, dangerous baritone that commanded the entire hallway. You are currently levying a baseless accusation of aggravated assault against a licensed attorney. That constitutes slander per se under state law, which carries a hefty financial penalty. However, that is the absolute least of your concerns right now. Patricia opened her mouth to interrupt, but David cut her off with a sharp, authoritative look. The glass your son drank from is currently in the possession of a bonded private security firm. David continued, articulating each word with surgical precision. It was secured using strict chain of custody protocols. It is en route to an independent, federally certified toxicology laboratory. When those results return, they will confirm the presence of a Schedule I synthetic hallucinogen. Furthermore, my investigative team has already secured the digital ledger, proving your son purchased that exact narcotic using an untraceable cryptocurrency wallet exactly 3 weeks ago. Richard swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as the legal terminology hit him. You are bluffing, he stammered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. I do not bluff, David replied coldly. I build airtight federal indictments. Your son intended to administer a chemical agent to my wife to induce a fraudulent psychiatric emergency. That is premeditated poisoning, a felony that carries a maximum sentence of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. The fact that his sheer incompetence led him to consume his own poison does not negate the intent of the crime. The actus reus and mens rea are both completely established. Patricia grabbed Richard's arm, her eyes wide with terror as she finally understood the magnitude of the trap they were in. You cannot prove any of this, she whispered desperately. I have the dark web receipt, the offshore routing numbers, and the digital footprint linking directly to Trent's office computer. David countered, stepping even closer so they could see the absolute certainty in his eyes. You brought a corporate scheme to a criminal prosecutor. You completely misjudged your opponent. I strongly advise you to stop throwing baseless, racially motivated threats in my direction and start looking for a criminal defense attorney who specializes in federal narcotics charges. You are going to need one before the sun comes up. David turned his back on them, dismissing their pathetic existence entirely, and focused his undivided attention back on the reinforced observation window. Inside the sterile room, Trent continued to thrash wildly against his heavy leather restraints, violently fighting a terrifying and completely losing battle against his own synthetic creation. This was just the absolute opening argument in a massive federal trial they had already definitively lost tonight. And I felt perfectly, undeniably, completely victorious. The sharp click of David turning his back on them was the final snap of the leash for my mother. Stripped of her ability to intimidate my husband, Patricia redirected her frantic energy toward the only target she thought she still controlled. Her manicured fingers clamped around my forearm with the desperate bruising grip of a drowning woman. Before I could pull away, she yanked me backward, physically dragging me away from the observation window and around the corner into a secluded, dimly lit corridor. The sudden quiet of this empty hospital wing stood in stark contrast to the chaotic trauma ward we had just left. Patricia slammed me against the cool plaster wall, her chest heaving the stench of stale champagne and panic rolling off her in waves. She looked completely unhinged. The perfectly poised matriarch was gone, replaced by a cornered animal willing to chew off her own limb to escape the trap. She cornered me, planting her hands flat against the wall on either side of my shoulders to box me in. "Listen to me very carefully, Naomi," Patricia hissed, her voice a frantic, breathless whisper. "You are going to go back out there and tell your husband to stand down. You are going to tell him he made a mistake, that Trent just had a bad reaction to some bad seafood at the reception. You are going to fix this right now." I stared at her, my expression completely flat. "You want me to lie to a federal prosecutor about an attempted poisoning that 300 people just witnessed? It was a prank." She spat back, her eyes wide and manic, as she launched into the most horrific campaign of psychological manipulation I had ever witnessed. It was just a stupid, harmless joke that went a little too far. Trent has been under an immense amount of pressure lately managing the family corporation. He just wanted to loosen you up for the reception. You always have to make everything about yourself, do you not? You always have to play the victim and blow everything completely out of proportion just to punish us. I let her speak. I let her weave her twisted, delusional reality because every word she said only validated my decision to destroy them. "You ruined your own wedding," Patricia continued, her voice trembling with misplaced rage. "You embarrassed this family in front of the most important investors in the state. Do you have any idea how much money we lost tonight in venue damages and canceled contracts? Trent is lying in a hospital bed because of your absolute selfishness. You switched those glasses on purpose. You deliberately poisoned your own brother." She paused, gasping for breath before delivering her ultimate demand. "You are paying for this, Naomi. I mean that literally. You are paying the emergency room bill. You are paying for his private recovery suite. You are paying for the damages to the estate ballroom, and you are going to publicly apologize to the corporate board for the scene you caused. It is the absolute least you can do after the ungrateful attitude you have displayed today. You owe this family for giving you the privileged life you have completely taken for granted." The sheer audacity of her demands was staggering. She was demanding I finance the recovery of the man who tried to destroy my mind. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply watched her spiral. "And that man you married," Patricia sneered, her face contorting with a deep, ugly prejudice as she brought David into her crosshairs. "You need to file for an annulment immediately. I warned you about bringing someone like him into our family. He is aggressive, Naomi. He is dangerous. Did you see the way he just threatened your father? He does not understand how things work in our world. He comes from a completely different background, a background that solves problems with intimidation instead of class." She stepped closer, invading my personal space, trying to use the proximity to assert her maternal dominance. "He is brainwashing you," she whispered, feigning a twisted sort of maternal concern. "He is turning you against your own blood because he wants our money. He is using his legal background to isolate you from the people who truly love you. You need to leave him before he ruins your life permanently. We can get our family lawyers to annul the marriage by Monday morning. We can protect your assets and bring you back into the fold where you belong. Just drop this ridiculous charade, pay for your brother's medical care, and come home." I stood perfectly still, absorbing the absolute toxicity of her words. She was invoking the classic abuser playbook, attempting to isolate the victim from their primary source of strength and support. She thought David was the mastermind. She thought David was the one pulling the strings because she could not fathom a reality where the daughter she had emotionally battered for 3 decades possessed the intelligence and the ruthlessness to orchestrate her own salvation. She looked at me expectantly, waiting for the familiar submission she had conditioned into me since childhood. She waited for me to lower my eyes, apologize for causing trouble, and pull out my checkbook to clean up Trent's mess. She genuinely believed her gaslighting had worked. She believed she had successfully rewritten the narrative of the night. The silence stretched between us in that dimly lit hospital corridor. I did not feel a single ounce of fear, guilt, or obligation. I felt an overwhelming absolute sense of liberation. My mother had just played her final desperate hand, and it was entirely comprised of weak, pathetic bluffs. She was trying to extort money from an auditor who already held the keys to her complete financial destruction. She smiled gently, truly thinking she had won the psychological battle so easily. She was entirely, undeniably, and completely wrong about absolutely everything tonight. I let her maintain that delusional, victorious smile for exactly 5 seconds. I did not scream. I did not defend my husband. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out the emergency room preliminary admission paperwork that the intake coordinator had handed me just before Patricia dragged me into this hallway. I calmly extended my hand, pressing the heavy clipboard against my mother's chest until her reflex forced her to take it. "What is this?" Patricia asked, her voice faltering as she glanced down at the intake forms. "That is the preliminary billing agreement for your son's VIP psychiatric recovery suite." I replied, my tone flat and entirely devoid of the submission she was desperately looking for. The hospital requires a designated guarantor for patients admitted under involuntary psychiatric holds. They need a deposit of $25,000 tonight to secure the specialized medical team monitoring his drug-induced psychosis. Patricia scoffed, attempting to recover her haughty demeanor. "Trent can cover his own medical expenses, Naomi. He is the chief executive officer of a massive corporation. He does not need you to handle his billing. Just hand this to his assistant tomorrow morning and stop trying to create unnecessary drama." She tried to shove the clipboard back toward me, but I stepped back, letting her arm hang foolishly in the empty space between us. "Trent cannot cover a parking ticket right now." "Mother," I stated, watching the arrogant dismissal slowly drain from her features. "You see, while you were busy trying to humiliate David and planning an annulment that will absolutely never happen, I was doing my job. I am a forensic accountant. Finding and stopping financial hemorrhages is what I do for a living. Exactly 1 hour ago, while Trent was busy screaming at invisible spiders in the ballroom, I initiated a total freeze on every single one of his corporate credit cards." Her eyes widened, the heavy diamond necklace resting against her collarbone, suddenly looking like a shiny noose. "You did what?" she gasped, her manicured fingers clutching the clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned stark white. "You have no authority to touch his accounts. He is the head of the family business." "I have every authority," I corrected her with surgical precision. As a senior shareholder and a certified auditor, I invoked the Emergency Fraud Protection Protocol with the Corporate Banking Division. I flagged an $8 million discrepancy in the family trust fund, linked it directly to Trent's executive routing numbers, and submitted the primary documentation to the bank's fraud department. The freeze is absolute. Trent's corporate platinum cards are dead. His personal checking accounts are suspended, pending a federal review. He cannot even buy a single cup of coffee, let alone finance a psychiatric deposit. Patricia shook her head violently, unable to process the reality of her collapsing empire. "You are lying," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You are just trying to scare me. You do not have that kind of power over the family accounts." Before I could deliver the final blow to her shattered reality, the heavy double doors at the end of the corridor swung open. My father stumbled into the hallway. Richard looked haggard. He held his smartphone pressed tightly against his ear, his face glistening with a cold sweat. He was no longer the imposing patriarch who had just threatened a former federal prosecutor. He was a terrified old man whose entire financial foundation had just evaporated completely into thin air. "What do you mean, frozen?" Richard yelled frantically into the receiver, his voice echoing sharply against the plaster walls. "I am a priority client. I have been banking with your institution for 3 decades. You cannot just lock my operational accounts without a warning." He listened for a moment, his jaw slackening as the voice on the other end delivered the news. "A fraud alert," he repeated, panic bleeding into his tone. "Initiated by whom?" "Listen to me. You need to override this immediately. I have vendors to pay tomorrow morning. I have a son in the hospital." Richard lowered the phone from his ear. He turned his head and locked eyes with me. The realization hit him. He saw the cold, calculated certainty in my posture. He saw the clipboard clutched in Patricia's shaking hands. "It was you," Richard breathed out, stepping toward us on unsteady legs. "The wealth manager just told me the corporate accounts, the trust fund, everything is locked down. They said a certified internal auditor flagged massive systemic embezzlement. You froze our money. I protected my assets." I corrected him, maintaining absolute eye contact. "I found Trent's phantom vendor network. I found the $8 million he siphoned out of the shared trust to fund his gambling habits and his luxury lifestyle. And I definitely found the impending Internal Revenue Service audit notice he tried to bury in his encrypted emails. You both thought I was just a naive, ungrateful daughter you could easily manipulate. You forgot that I literally dismantle corrupt corporations for a living." Patricia let out a strangled sob, reaching out to grab Richard's arm for physical support. "Richard, tell her to undo it," she pleaded, her voice hysterical. "Tell her to call the bank and lift the freeze. The hospital needs a deposit for Trent. We need to pay the ballroom damages. There is no undoing this," I told them, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The bank's automated reporting system has already forwarded the fraud flags to the federal financial oversight agencies. The money is gone. Your golden child is currently handcuffed to a hospital bed, raving out of his mind, and you have exactly $0 to bail him out. You wanted me to pay for his mistakes. Consider the frozen accounts my contribution." I turned my back on them, leaving them standing in the dark hallway, clutching a hospital bill they could no longer afford as I walked back to my husband. The morning after the wedding disaster, the sky over Manhattan hung low and gray, perfectly matching the mood inside the sleek, glass-enclosed conference room of Vance, Sterling and Hayes, my family's corporate law firm. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and barely contained panic. I sat at the far end of the massive mahogany table, David, an immovable force, right beside me. We had not slept, having spent the night coordinating with federal contacts and reinforcing our digital barricades. Opposite us sat my parents and Trent. My brother had been discharged from the psychiatric suite just hours ago, apparently, after a massive dose of sedatives and a frantic off-the-books consultation with a private physician who specialized in discretion for high-net-worth clients. He looked terrible. His skin was a sickly, translucent gray, and his hands trembled slightly as they rested on the polished wood. But his arrogance had miraculously survived the stomach pumping. He wore a rumpled designer suit, attempting to project an image of exhausted authority, though his eyes kept darting nervously toward David. Richard and Patricia flanked him like protective gargoyles. My father's tie was loose, and the bags under his eyes spoke of a night spent screaming at wealth managers who refused to unfreeze his accounts. Patricia's makeup was flawless, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of control, but her lips were pressed into a tight white line. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries," Richard began, his voice a low, gravelly growl that usually commanded obedience. He slammed a thick, leather-bound folder onto the table. "You have made your point, Naomi. You threw a tantrum, you embarrassed us, and you temporarily locked the accounts. We are willing to overlook this massive breach of familial loyalty, provided we rectify the situation immediately." I did not touch the folder. I simply raised an eyebrow. "Overlook. That is incredibly generous of you, Dad, considering I am the one who caught Trent embezzling $8 million from the family trust." Trent flinched, but Patricia immediately jumped in, her voice shrill with indignation. "He did not embezzle anything. He was managing the trust. He made some aggressive investments to secure the company's future. You are twisting standard business practices to suit your vindictive narrative. Buying exotic sports cars through shell companies and wiring funds to offshore gambling accounts are not standard business practices, Mother," I replied, my voice chillingly even. "They are federal crimes." "Enough," Richard barked, slamming his hand against the table. "The semantics do not matter right now. What matters is the impending IRS audit." He leaned forward, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me completely, ignoring the fact that David was glaring back at him with the intensity of a coiled spring. "The audit is in 14 days. The trust must be replenished before they review the ledgers. If it is not, the corporation faces devastating penalties, and Trent's position could be compromised." "His position?" I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "His position should be in a federal penitentiary. He stole from the company, and he stole my half of the inheritance. Trent finally spoke, his voice raspy and weak, yet dripping with entitlement. It is family money, Naomi. We all benefit from the corporation's success. I needed liquidity for a high-yield opportunity. It did not pan out. It happens. You are overreacting. You bought hallucinogenic narcotics on the dark web and tried to drug me at my own wedding to declare me mentally incapacitated so you could legally steal my shares. I stated, articulating every syllable with deliberate precision. That is not an overreaction. That is attempted aggravated assault and premeditated fraud. Patricia gasped, clutching her pearls in a dramatic display of fake outrage. How dare you accuse your brother of such a heinous thing? He had a severe allergic reaction to the caterer's seafood. You are spinning wild conspiracy theories because you have always been jealous of him. They were sticking to the lie. Even now, with their bank accounts frozen and the evidence looming over them, they were trying to gaslight me into submission. It was pathetic, yet terrifyingly predictable. We are not here to debate your paranoid delusions, Richard continued, pushing the leather folder closer to me. We are here to save the family. Inside that folder is a transfer agreement. It relinquishes your corporate shares back to the Central Trust. It is the only asset large enough to cover the deficit before the IRS arrives. You will sign it, Naomi. You will sign it today, and I will instruct the bank to lift the fraud freeze. I stared at the folder, the sheer audacity of their demand washing over me. You want me to surrender my entire net worth to cover Trent's crimes? It is your duty, Patricia insisted, her voice taking on that familiar, manipulative tone. You are part of this family. We protect our own. Trent is the CEO. The company cannot survive a scandal of this magnitude. If he falls, we all fall. You must make this sacrifice for the greater good. The greater good? I echoed, shaking my head slowly. You mean Trent's good. You mean maintaining your country club memberships and your fake reputation. Sign the damn papers, Naomi, Trent hissed, his facade slipping, revealing the frantic desperation underneath. If you do not, I swear, I will sue you for everything you have. I will claim you poisoned me. I have medical records from the hospital. I can say you spiked my drink because you wanted to seize control of the company. He was actually threatening me with the very crime he had attempted to commit. The twisted logic was almost breathtaking. They truly believed they could bully me into compliance, that the weight of familial expectation and the threat of a messy legal battle would force me to fold, just as I had done so many times during my childhood. I looked at David. He had remained completely silent throughout this exchange, letting them dig their graves deeper with every word. He gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. You really think you can corner me? I asked, turning my attention back to my father. You think you can threaten me into giving you my shares to save a thief? I am not threatening you, Richard said, his eyes cold and hard. I am giving you an order. Sign the transfer, or I will ensure you are legally and financially ruined. I will tie you up in litigation for the rest of your life. I smiled, a genuine, terrifying smile that caused Trent to shrink back in his chair. You are going to need those lawyers, Dad, I said softly, but not for me. Richard lunged forward, the heavy oak chair scraping violently against the polished floor. He slammed both his hands onto the mahogany table, leaning over the surface, until his face was inches from mine. The veins in his neck pulsed with a toxic mixture of adrenaline and absolute fury. Do not play games with me, Naomi, Richard roared, his voice shaking the glass walls of the conference room. You think you are untouchable because you married a lawyer. You think your little corporate accounting tricks give you leverage over this family. You have absolutely no idea what I am capable of doing to protect my legacy. I did not lean back at all. I maintained steady, unbroken eye contact, my face a mask of absolute calm. My silence only infuriated him further. I will destroy you, he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous, serrated whisper. If you do not sign those transfer papers right this second, I am going directly to the district attorney. I will file formal charges of aggravated assault against you. I have the medical reports from the emergency room. My son was admitted with a life-threatening chemical substance in his system, and you were the only person sitting next to him at that table. Patricia quickly jumped in, eager to reinforce the fabricated narrative. We have dozens of witnesses who saw you switch the glasses, Naomi. We have friends, highly influential friends, who will gladly testify that you acted suspiciously right before Trent collapsed. They will tell the police that you have always harbored a deep, malicious jealousy toward your brother. They will paint you as a bitter, unstable woman who tried to murder her own sibling to seize control of the family trust fund. The sheer audacity of their lie was breathtaking. They were literally projecting Trent's exact crime onto me, planning to use their wealth and social connections to manipulate the justice system. Trent, emboldened by his parents' aggressive assault, leaned back in his chair and adjusted his ruined jacket. He let out a condescending scoff. "You really thought you were smarter than us, little sister. You thought you could freeze my accounts and play the hero. But you are just a sad, desperate girl who tried to poison me. The police will take one look at the hospital records and slap cuffs on your wrists before sunset. Sign the papers, Naomi. Sign them, and maybe we will decide not to press charges. Maybe we will just let you walk away with nothing, which is exactly what you deserve." They expected tears, frantic denials, or a desperate plea for mercy. They wanted me to beg. I gave them absolutely nothing. I sat perfectly still, letting their threats hang in the heavy, sterile air of the conference room. I did not defend myself. I did not point out the gaping holes in their ridiculous narrative. I just let the silence stretch out thick and suffocating. My silence unsettled them. I watched the micro-expressions flicker across their faces. Richard's jaw twitched. Patricia nervously adjusted her pearl necklace. Trent's arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by a shadow of deep, primal uncertainty. They were used to a daughter who fought back, who argued, who desperately tried to prove her worth. They did not know how to handle a woman who simply watched them dig their own graves. "You think your husband can save you?" Patricia suddenly sneered, turning her venom toward David. She pointed a manicured finger at him. "If you do not sign those papers, we will ruin him too. We will file complaints with the State Bar Association. We will drag his name through the mud in every major financial publication in this city. We will tell everyone that he orchestrated this entire plot to steal our family wealth, a former federal prosecutor marrying into money and trying to murder the primary heir. The media will absolutely devour him. His career will be over." David did not react. He sat beside me like a statue carved from obsidian, radiating immense quiet power. He did not need to raise his voice or issue petty threats. He simply observed them the way a scientist observes a particularly pathetic specimen in a laboratory. His silence, much like mine, was entirely calculated. "Are you deaf?" Richard demanded, his frustration boiling over as our mutual silence dragged on. "This is not a negotiation. The Internal Revenue Service is coming. The trust must be funded. You are going to sign the asset transfer agreement right now, or I swear to you I will make sure you spend the next 20 years rotting in a state prison." He pushed the leather-bound folder across the table until it touched the edge of my laptop. A sleek silver pen rolled out, stopping right in front of my hand. "Sign it," Trent commanded, his voice trembling slightly, betraying the immense fear hiding just beneath his arrogant facade. "Stop being a stubborn, selfish brat and fix the mess you made. Sign the damn papers so I can get my money back." I looked at the folder, then at the pen, and finally back at my father. They had laid out their entire extortion plot. They had explicitly threatened me with fabricated criminal charges, blackmail, and public defamation to force a financial transaction. They had openly admitted to a conspiracy to commit perjury and fraud. And they had done it all while sitting in a room with a former federal prosecutor who knew exactly how to turn their own words into a lethal legal weapon. I let the silence hold for another 10 seconds, ensuring they felt the full crushing weight of their own desperation. Then I slowly turned my head and looked at David. David finally moved. He reached down and unlocked the brass clasps of his leather briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room, signaling the absolute end of their reign. David stood up, moving with the unhurried grace of a man who held every advantage in this war. He did not rush. He let the sharp clicks of the brass clasps linger in the air, a manifestation of the trap snapping shut. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved a heavy, transparent plastic pouch. He placed it dead center on the mahogany table directly over the transfer agreement my father had demanded I sign. Inside the tamper-evident plastic was a crystal champagne flute. A faint powdery residue coated the bottom of the glass. A bright red evidence tag sealed the top, complete with a barcode, a timestamp, and a signature. Trent stared at the bag, his complexion turning chalky white. His eyes darted from the glass to David, a spark of terror breaking through his arrogant facade. "You see, Richard," David began, his voice a smooth baritone that instantly commanded the room. "When you operate in federal courtrooms for as long as I have, you learn never to leave anything to chance. You also learn that criminals, especially entitled ones who think wealth makes them invisible, always make sloppy mistakes." David tapped a long finger against the plastic evidence bag. "This is the exact champagne flute your son brought to the table last night, the one he intended for Naomi." The moment he walked away, an agent from a private security firm secured this glass. It was handled using strict chain of custody protocols, transported in a lockbox, and delivered directly to an independent toxicology laboratory. Patricia let out a shaky breath, her manicured hands fluttering to her throat. "You stole property from our wedding venue," she stammered, her voice lacking any authority. "You cannot just take things. That proves absolutely nothing." David did not even look at her. He reached into his briefcase and extracted a white envelope bearing the embossed seal of a prominent medical diagnostics facility. He opened it slowly, sliding a document onto the table next to the glass. "This is the expedited toxicology report," David stated, his tone shifting into the precise cadence he used during opening statements. "It was finalized at 6 o'clock this morning. The laboratory found high concentrations of a synthetic hallucinogenic compound coating the interior of this flute. It is a Schedule I narcotic engineered to induce paranoia, auditory and visual hallucinations, and temporary cognitive collapse. In layman's terms, it is designed to simulate a massive schizophrenic break." Richard swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the laboratory seal. He tried to speak, but the words seemed to die in his throat. David continued pacing slowly behind my chair, resting a hand on my shoulder. "What makes this particular chemical compound so fascinating is that it is not easy to acquire. You cannot pick it up at a pharmacy, and you certainly cannot blame it on bad catering seafood. It requires a specialized vendor operating on the dark web. It also requires an untraceable cryptocurrency transaction." Trent pushed his chair back, the wooden legs squealing harshly against the floor. "This is a setup!" Trent yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "You planted that. You and Naomi fabricated this entire thing to frame me. You want to steal my company?" David smiled, a cold expression that offered zero mercy to the pathetic man scrambling for an excuse. "We did not need to frame you, Trent. You left a digital trail so wide it practically begged us to follow it. My investigative team tracked your secondary browser history. We traced the cryptocurrency wallet you used. We have the transaction hash, the timestamp, and the digital receipt matching the purchase of this exact chemical compound to the IP address of your private office computer." The silence that descended upon the conference room was absolute. It was the suffocating silence of a complete and total checkmate. The bluster, the threats, and the racist microaggressions my parents had hurled moments ago evaporated into the sterile air. They were looking at physical evidence of a major felony. "You just threatened my wife with a fabricated charge of aggravated assault," David said, looking directly at my father. "You openly conspired to commit perjury by threatening to bribe witnesses to lie to the police. You attempted to use extortion and blackmail to force a financial transaction. That is racketeering, Richard. That is witness tampering, extortion, and conspiracy. You just handed me enough ammunition to put this entire room in federal prison before lunch." Patricia began to cry, actual tears spilling over her expensive foundation. "Richard," she gasped, grabbing his arm. "Richard, do something. Tell him he cannot do this. We are a prominent family. We have connections." Richard looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting to hit the ground. He stared at the toxicology report, then at the sealed glass, and finally at David. You would not dare go to the police with this. Richard whispered, his voice stripped of all its former power. The scandal would ruin the family name forever. It would tank the corporate stock completely. Naomi would lose everything too. David let out a low, humorless chuckle. You still do not understand the dynamic here, Richard. Naomi does not care about your family name. She built her own name entirely from scratch. And as for the corporate stock, it is already completely worthless, because Trent did not just try to poison his sister to seize control of her wealth. He poisoned the entire company from the inside out. David stepped back and gestured toward me. I opened my laptop, awaking the screen. The financial audit I had prepared overnight was ready to be displayed. The physical evidence had shattered their extortion attempt and destroyed their leverage. Now it was time to show them exactly why their golden child had been driven to commit such a desperate psychotic crime in the first place. The trap was fully sprung, and there was no way out for any of them. Before I illuminated the screen, David reached into his briefcase one final time. He retrieved a thick, heavily bound stack of legal-sized paper and let it drop onto the mahogany table with a resounding, heavy thud. It landed right next to the sealed evidence bag and the toxicology report, perfectly symbolizing the inescapable legal nightmare that was about to consume his fragile life. This is a 40-page draft of a federal indictment, David announced, his voice devoid of any sympathy. I spent the morning collaborating with the United States Attorney's Office. This document outlines every single criminal charge your son is currently facing. It includes wire fraud, illegal acquisition of a Schedule I controlled substance, and attempted aggravated assault. It also details the financial penalties, asset forfeitures, and the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. Read every single page very carefully, Richard, because it is all meticulously documented. Your heir is looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Richard stared at the thick stack of paper as if it were a live grenade. Patricia covered her mouth, stifling a sob. Trent looked physically ill, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape route that did not exist. The criminal charges are just the symptom, I interjected, stepping fully into my element. The disease is entirely financial. I tapped a key on my laptop. The motorized projection screen descended silently from the ceiling at the far end of the conference room. The high-definition projector hummed to life, casting a stark, blindingly bright spreadsheet across the canvas. For 30 years, you have paraded this corporation around as a shining beacon of generational wealth, I stated, walking toward the head of the table. You handed the keys to Trent because you believed his expensive suits and country club charm equated to business acumen. You despised my career as an auditor. You called it tedious, unglamorous, and unworthy of the family legacy. Today, that tedious career is going to show you the absolute reality of your blind arrogance. The screen displayed the primary corporate ledger. The profit and loss statements initially appear functional and stable. This is the fabricated reality Trent has been feeding the board of directors for 3 years. But forensic accounting looks for the negative space. We look for the bleed. I pressed a button on my presentation remote. The screen shifted, diving deep into the subsidiary operational costs and the vendor payout histories. Rows of data lit up in glaring crimson. These are your operational expenditures, I continued, my voice echoing with clinical precision. Over the past 36 months, the corporation has hemorrhaged cash through a labyrinth of secondary accounts. I tracked the routing numbers. The funds were siphoned out of your daily operating budget and funneled directly into the shared family trust fund. Richard frowned, his business instincts briefly piercing through his panic. The trust fund is a reserve, he argued weakly. Transferring capital into the trust is a standard strategy. It is a protection strategy if the trust is actually holding the capital, I corrected him sharply. I clicked to the next slide. A massive negative integer flashed onto the screen in bold red font. The trust fund is completely empty, Dad. In fact, it is exactly $8 million in the red. A suffocating silence slammed into the room. Richard gripped the edges of the table, his knuckles turning white. Patricia stopped crying, her breath catching in her throat. The magnitude of the number paralyzed them. $8 million was a catastrophic breach of their entire financial foundation. Where exactly did the massive amount of money go? Richard demanded, his voice dropping to a hoarse, terrified whisper. He turned his head slowly, locking his eyes onto Trent. Where is the $8 million now, Trent? Trent shrank back into his expensive leather chair, swallowing incredibly hard as panic overtook his entire body. He refused to look at his father. He stared at the polished mahogany table, his arrogant posture completely collapsing under the weight of his undeniable guilt. He did not just lose it in a bad market, I explained, refusing to let Trent hide in the silence. He deliberately and systematically stole it. When the trust ran dry, he panicked. He created a network of phantom vendors to bleed the corporate operating accounts, desperately trying to funnel cash back into the trust to hide the deficit. But a failing business cannot generate enough revenue to cover an $8 million black hole. I advanced the presentation to a new graphic. It mapped out 5 different limited liability companies showing the fraudulent invoices Trent had been approving. He authorized millions of dollars in payments for logistics and consulting services to entities that do not exist. No physical addresses, no payroll records, no actual deliverables. Just empty shell companies designed to wash the stolen capital. I moved to the final slide of this segment. An official document appeared on the screen, bearing the unmistakable seal of the Internal Revenue Service. And this, I announced, my tone ringing with absolute finality, is why he bought a military-grade hallucinogen on the dark web and tried to destroy my mind at my own wedding. The room stared at the federal notice. The IRS flagged the anomalies in the corporate tax returns. I continued making sure every word hit like a physical blow. They scheduled a comprehensive on-site federal audit for exactly 14 days from now. When those agents arrive, they will demand to see the trust fund verification. Trent knew he was facing decades in federal prison for corporate fraud and massive tax evasion. He needed $8 million immediately to replenish the trust before the auditors walked through your front doors. I walked back to my laptop and looked directly at my father. His only available asset large enough to cover his crimes was my portfolio of shares. So he planned to legally steal my assets to save himself. Richard stared at the projection screen, his mouth opening and closing as the reality of the impending federal audit settled over him. But the denial was too deeply ingrained in his psyche. He turned his desperate gaze back to his son, searching for any plausible explanation. "Trent," Richard pleaded, his voice trembling with fragile hope, "tell me this is a misunderstanding. Tell me you moved the capital into a secure offshore holding account for tax optimization. Tell me you did not actually lose $8 million of our family legacy." Trent remained completely silent, sinking deeper into the expensive leather of his chair. He looked like a cornered rat, his arrogant swagger replaced by the cold sweat of a trapped criminal. He had nothing to say because there was no brilliant business strategy to hide behind. "He did not optimize anything, Dad," I answered for him, pressing the button on my remote. The screen shifted from the bleak ledgers to an itemized breakdown of Trent's personal spending. He did not invest the trust fund. He liquidated it to fund a lifestyle he could never afford on his corporate salary. I highlighted the first section of the spreadsheet, zooming in on massive wire transfers. "Let us start with the vehicles," I said, my voice echoing with clinical precision. "A customized Ferrari, a vintage Porsche, and an armored Mercedes SUV. The expenditure on luxury automobiles exceeds $1.2 million. He purchased them through a dummy corporation in Delaware to avoid paying property taxes and to keep the assets hidden from the board." Patricia gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles stark white. "He needs reliable transportation for his position." She stammered desperately, trying to construct a defense. "He is the chief executive officer. He has to maintain an image of success to attract investors. It is a necessary business expense, Naomi. You are deliberately twisting a legitimate networking strategy to make your brother look bad." I actually laughed, a sharp sound that sliced through the heavy tension. "A vintage Porsche is not a networking strategy, Mother. It is a midlife crisis financed by stolen money. But let us move on to his offshore recreational activities." I clicked to the next slide. A cascade of international banking records flooded the screen. $3 million vanished into highly encrypted accounts based in Macau and the Cayman Islands. These are not investment portfolios. They are exclusive offshore gambling syndicates. Trent has been losing hundreds of thousands of dollars a night playing baccarat and poker, desperately trying to win back the money he originally stole from the trust. He was chasing his losses, doubling down with company capital every single time he lost a hand. Richard buried his face in his hands, letting out an agonizing groan. The foundation of his empire was crumbling before his eyes, destroyed not by a hostile corporate takeover, but by his own golden child's rampant gambling addiction. And finally, I continued refusing to give them a single second to recover. We have his real estate ventures. I pulled up a map of Manhattan marked with 3 distinct red pins in the most expensive zip codes. He leased 3 luxury penthouses, one in Tribeca, one in Soho, and one on the Upper East Side. The monthly rent for these properties totals over $70,000. Those are corporate suites, Patricia interrupted, her voice shaking violently as she clung to her delusional reality. He uses them to host visiting dignitaries and international clients. It is a standard corporate hospitality practice. They are not corporate suites, I corrected her, my tone dropping to a deadly register. I pulled the security logs. No international clients have ever set foot inside those apartments. He uses them exclusively to house his mistresses. He has been using the family trust fund to pay the rent, buy designer jewelry, and fund the lavish lifestyles of 3 different women simultaneously. Trent finally snapped. "Shut up!" he screamed, slamming his fist against the table. "Just shut your mouth, Naomi. You have no right to dig into my personal life. You bought a military-grade narcotic on the dark web and tried to poison me at my wedding." I shot back, stepping forward until I was standing directly over him. "You surrendered your right to privacy the moment you spiked my champagne. I am an auditor, Trent. I follow the money, and your money leads directly to a prison cell." Richard raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. He swallowed hard, attempting to gather the shattered remnants of his patriarchal authority. "He did not steal it," Richard stated, his voice a raspy imitation of his commanding tone. "He has discretionary access to the trust for emergencies. He just borrowed the capital. He borrowed it to manage personal liabilities, and he was going to pay it back. It is an internal family financial matter. We can restructure the debt. We can liquidate some secondary properties and quietly refill the trust before the audit. There is no need to involve the federal authorities over a simple internal borrowing dispute." Patricia nodded vigorously, clutching her husband's arm. "Yes, exactly. He just borrowed it. Families help each other, Naomi. Families cover for each other during difficult times. We can fix this quietly. You are blowing a temporary cash flow issue completely out of proportion because you want to see your brother fail." I stared at them, absolutely disgusted by the depths of their depravity. They were staring at $8 million in gambling debts, luxury cars, and mistress apartments, and they were still trying to classify it as a minor accounting error. "You cannot borrow money you never intend to repay, Dad," I said, my voice ringing with absolute facts. "You certainly cannot restructure massive debt when the bank accounts are entirely frozen. The Internal Revenue Service does not care about your toxic family loyalty. They care about wire fraud. They care about tax evasion. They care about shell companies." "But that is not even the most repulsive part of this entire tragedy," I said, lowering my voice to a dangerous, steady calm that made the room feel instantly 10 degrees colder. "You sit there trying to convince me that Trent acted alone. You are playing the role of the shocked, desperate parents trying to clean up a sudden mess. You want me to believe this is just an unfortunate cash flow issue that caught you completely off guard." I walked back to my laptop and rested my hand on the keyboard. I let my eyes drift from my mother's pale, trembling face to my father's rigid jawline. "You almost had me convinced," I admitted, letting the silence stretch for a moment. "Up until 2 days ago, I genuinely believed you were just blind, enabling parents who refused to see the monster you raised. I thought Trent had fooled you just as thoroughly as he tried to fool the board of directors." Then I decrypted the private communication servers attached to the executive suite, I said, pressing the spacebar. The projection screen behind me flickered and shifted. The spreadsheets and banking ledgers vanished, replaced by stark black and white text. It was a chain of internal corporate emails completely uncensored and timestamped over the past 6 months. "Let us look at Exhibit A," I announced, stepping to the side so they had an unobstructed view of their own damnation. "This is an email thread between Trent and you, Dad. It is dated exactly 4 months ago. This was right around the time the first warning letter arrived from the Internal Revenue Service." I read the text aloud, ensuring the words echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. Trent writes, quote, "The deficit is too large to hide before the quarterly review. We are short 8 million. End quote. And here is your response, Richard. Quote, "We will pivot the liability. Keep the phantom vendors running to show operational costs. I will initiate the medical proxy protocol for your sister. We just need a trigger event to activate the liquidation clause." End quote. Patricia let out a choked, terrified gasp. She slapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically to the locked doors as if she could simply run away from the digital evidence glowing brightly on the wall. "You knew," I stated, turning my gaze to my father. "You knew he stole $8 million and your immediate reaction was not to hold him accountable. Your immediate reaction was to ask how you could legally steal my assets to cover his tracks. You orchestrated the medical power of attorney. You came up with the idea to strip me of my bodily autonomy and my financial independence just to keep your golden boy out of federal prison." I clicked to the next slide. Another email appeared, this one marked highly confidential and sent directly from Patricia's private account to Trent. "And do not think you are exempt from this conspiracy." "Mother," I said, my voice hardening into absolute ice. "You were the one who suggested the timing. Let us read your brilliant contribution to this criminal enterprise." Quote, "Wait until the wedding, Trent. Naomi will be under immense stress. If she has a public breakdown in front of the senators and the board, no one will question her instability. It will be tragic, but necessary. We will take control of her shares by Monday morning." End quote. I stopped reading and stared at the woman who had given birth to me. The woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was difficult, dramatic, and ungrateful. She was staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes, her chest heaving as panic completely consumed her. "You plan to drug me at my own wedding," I said, articulating every single syllable so they could not escape the horror of their own actions. "You actively conspired to induce a chemical psychiatric break. You wanted me to be hauled away in a straitjacket. You wanted me locked inside a medical facility, heavily sedated and stripped of my basic human rights just so you could steal my corporate shares. You were willing to completely destroy my mind, my marriage, and my freedom to save a gambling addict who used company funds to buy sports cars and luxury apartments for his mistresses." Richard tried to stand up, his hands shaking violently against the table. "Naomi, you are taking this completely out of context. We never meant for you to be permanently hurt. The drug was only supposed to last a few hours. We were going to make sure you received the best private psychiatric care. We were going to keep you comfortable. We just needed temporary control of the assets to save the family legacy. It was a temporary measure." David let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that cut through my father's pathetic explanation. "A temporary measure," David repeated, stepping forward, the sheer force of his presence driving Richard back down into his chair. "You actively plotted to poison a federal prosecutor's wife to commit corporate fraud. You put your conspiracy in writing on a company server. You did not just cross a moral line, Richard. You built a criminal syndicate and documented every step of your own felony conspiracy." Trent put his head down on the table, burying his face in his arms. He was utterly broken, realizing that his parents' protection could no longer shield him from the consequences of his actions. He let out a muffled, pathetic sob. "You sold me out. I told my parents the absolute clarity of their betrayal, leaving me feeling entirely devoid of any residual grief or hesitation. You spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset. I was never your daughter. I was just an insurance policy, a backup fund you could liquidate the second your precious son made a mistake." Patricia fell to her knees right there on the polished hardwood floor of the conference room. She ignored her ruined designer dress and crawled toward me, her hands reaching out in a desperate, frantic plea. "Naomi, please," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. We were desperate. We were terrified of losing everything we built. We love you. We are your parents. You cannot destroy us like this. We are your blood. Please show us some mercy. I looked down at the woman weeping at my feet. I saw the absolute desperation in her eyes, the sheer terror of a woman realizing her entire world of privilege, status, and control was about to evaporate forever. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of daughterly obligation. I stepped back, ensuring her reaching hands grasped only empty air. I looked at the emails still glowing brightly on the projection screen, displaying the irrefutable proof of their monstrous betrayal. You do not know the meaning of the word mercy, I told her coldly. And you are about to learn that the justice system does not care about your bloodline right now. The silence that followed my statement was absolute, broken only by the ragged, pathetic sound of my mother gasping for air on the floor. Patricia remained on her knees, her hands clutching at the empty space where I had just been standing. Her designer dress was wrinkled, her perfect hair disheveled, and her dignity entirely shattered. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the lifelong emotional leash she had kept around my neck was permanently severed. Trent suddenly shattered the heavy silence with a loud, wet sob. He lifted his head from his arms, his face red and swollen, tears mixing with the cold sweat on his cheeks. He did not look at me. He turned his desperate, frantic eyes toward Richard and Patricia. He was looking at the people who had built him into a monster, and he was about to tear them down to save himself. "This is your fault," Trent screamed, his voice cracking as he pointed a shaking finger at our father. "You did this to me. You put me in that executive chair and expected me to perform miracles. You demanded constant expansion and relentless perfection. You never cared if I actually knew how to run the business. You just wanted a handsome son to parade around the country club and show off to your wealthy investor friends. You pushed me into a corner." Richard stared at him, his face draining of color. "Trent, stop talking," he warned, his voice low and trembling. "You are making it worse." "I am not making it worse!" Trent roared, pushing himself up from the table, his chair tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. "It cannot possibly get worse. I am looking at 15 years in federal prison because you enabled me. Every time I made a mistake, you covered it up. Every time I overspent, you handed me a corporate credit card and told me to hide the expenses. You taught me that the rules did not apply to our family. You told me the trust fund was my ultimate safety net." Patricia let out a horrified gasp, covering her face with her hands. "Trent, please," she begged, her voice muffled. "Do not say these things." "Why should I stay quiet?" Trent demanded, his panic escalating into a full-blown meltdown. "You both knew I was drowning in gambling debts. You knew I was losing millions in Macau, and you told me to just keep moving the money around. You said Naomi would never find out. You said she was too stupid and too submissive to ever question the corporate ledgers. You literally handed me the dark web instructions to buy the narcotic. You told me to spike her drink so we could trigger the medical power of attorney. You planned the entire poisoning. You orchestrated everything." The absolute cowardice of my brother was entirely on display. The moment he realized the ship was sinking, he eagerly tied the anchor around his parents' necks. He threw them under the bus, hoping that shifting the blame would lessen his own criminal liability. Patricia crawled across the floor, abandoning her son to lunge toward me again. She grabbed my trousers, her fingers digging desperately into the fabric. "Naomi, please listen to me," she wailed, her voice shrill and agonizing. "He is lying. He is just scared. I am your mother. I carried you. I gave you life. You cannot let them take me away. You cannot let them put me in a cage. I did it because I was terrified of losing our home. I was trying to keep our family together. A mother does absolutely anything to protect her beloved children. Please show some mercy." I looked down at the woman clinging to my leg. She was attempting to weaponize the very concept of maternal love, twisting the most sacred biological bond into a cheap bargaining chip. She wanted me to feel a profound emotional duty to save her, completely ignoring the fact that she had actively conspired to destroy my sanity just 48 hours ago. I forcefully stepped backward, tearing the fabric of my trousers from her frantic grip. Do not ever use the word mother with me again, I commanded, my voice echoing like a gunshot in the sterile conference room. A mother protects her child from monsters. You became the monster. You sat in the front row of my wedding, smiling at me, knowing I was about to drink a military-grade hallucinogen. You watched me take a sip, and you felt absolutely nothing but greed. David stepped up beside me, a towering wall of protective fury. He looked down at Patricia with unvarnished disgust. You surrendered your parental rights the second you plotted to poison your daughter. David stated, his tone freezing the air in the room. You are not a family anymore. You are a criminal syndicate, and your enterprise has officially filed for bankruptcy. Do not attempt to touch my wife ever again. Patricia collapsed onto the floor, curling into a tight ball, sobbing uncontrollably. Richard remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the projected emails on the wall, completely catatonic as his entire empire turned to dust. Trent backed into the corner of the room, sliding down the glass wall until he was sitting on the floor, pulling his knees to his chest like a frightened, pathetic child. I stood tall, feeling an immense, undeniable weight lift off my shoulders forever. The heavy chains of familial obligation, the constant desire for approval, the desperate need to be loved by people incapable of love, it was all completely gone. They had tried to break me, but they had only succeeded in forging me into a weapon that dismantled their entire existence. I drew an absolute, uncrossable boundary right there on the polished hardwood. They would never touch my life again. Today marked the permanent and absolute end of their reign. The heavy silence in the conference room was suddenly shattered by a faint, high-pitched wail echoing from the busy Manhattan streets below. At first, the sound was easily dismissed as just another piece of city background noise, but the wail grew steadily louder, multiplying and layering, until it became an undeniable, deafening roar of approaching sirens. The flashing red and blue lights began to reflect off the surrounding glass skyscrapers, casting frantic, strobing colors into our mahogany boardroom. Richard finally lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute terror as he stared at the floor-to-ceiling windows. Patricia stopped her pathetic weeping and scrambled into a sitting position on the hardwood floor, her chest heaving with fresh panic. Trent remained huddled in the corner, pressing his palms against his ears as if trying to block out the inescapable reality of his own destruction. They all looked at me, their faces twisted into masks of pure horror. They had genuinely believed we were just engaging in a hostile negotiation. They actually thought they could bully their way out of a federal indictment using tears and empty promises. I stood perfectly still beside David, watching the color completely drain from my father's face. You called them, Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. You actually called the authorities on your own family. I did not call anyone today, I corrected him, my voice devoid of any sympathy. David filed the comprehensive evidence packet with the federal task force early this morning. The arrest warrants were signed by a federal judge an hour before you even unlocked the doors to this building. We were just waiting for you to explicitly confess to extortion and conspiracy in a room with a recorded security feed. Before Richard could even process the magnitude of that statement, heavy footsteps pounded down the exterior hallway. The chaotic commotion outside grew incredibly loud. Secretaries gasped and office chairs scraped frantically against the floorboards as the receptionist shouted protests. The imposing, solid oak doors of the conference room burst open with tremendous, terrifying force. The heavy wood slammed violently against the interior walls. A tactical team of federal agents flanked by uniformed local police officers flooded into the room. They moved with absolute synchronized precision, immediately securing every exit and establishing a rigid perimeter. Their dark tactical vests bore the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The sheer physical presence of heavily armed law enforcement inside the most exclusive corporate law firm in the city was a shocking, brilliant spectacle. The pristine illusion of my family's untouchable elite status shattered instantly. A tall, broad-shouldered special agent stepped into the center of the room. He bypassed my parents entirely, his sharp gaze locking directly onto the pathetic man cowering in the corner. Trenton the agent announced, his voice booming with absolute uncompromising authority. "Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Trent let out a strangled, terrified whimper. He pressed himself harder against the glass wall, shaking his head frantically. "No," Trent babbled, tears streaming down his face as his arrogant facade completely dissolved. "No, please, it was just a misunderstanding. It is family money. My dad said it was fine. Tell them, Dad. Tell them I had permission." Richard remained absolutely frozen in his chair, completely incapable of saving his precious golden child. He could not protect Trent from the federal government. Two agents stepped forward, grabbing Trent by his arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. He thrashed weakly, crying out for his mother, but the agents easily overpowered him. They spun him around and slammed him face first against the glass wall. Patricia let out a blood-curdling shriek, scrambling across the floor toward the agents. "Do not hurt him!" she screamed, reaching desperately for her son. "He is sick. He just got out of the hospital. You cannot treat him like a common criminal." A uniformed police officer swiftly stepped into her path, holding up a firm hand to block her advance. "Ma'am, step back immediately," the officer warned, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "Interfere with a federal arrest, and you will be placed in handcuffs right next to him." Patricia collapsed back onto her heels, sobbing uncontrollably as she was forced to watch her perfect son get treated exactly like the criminal he was. The sharp, heavy metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around Trent's wrists echoed loudly throughout the room. It was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. "Trenton, you are under arrest," the special agent declared, reciting the Miranda rights with a cold, practiced efficiency. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." "What are the charges?" Richard finally managed to choke out, his voice a broken rasp. The agent turned his head slightly to address my father, though he did not loosen his grip on Trent. "Your son is being taken into federal custody on a 43-count indictment. The primary charges include aggregate wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and international money laundering. Furthermore, he is being charged with attempted aggravated assault with a chemical agent and possession of a Schedule I narcotic." Trent sobbed loudly, his forehead pressed against the cool glass. "I did not mean to do it," he wailed, absolutely destroying any chance he had at a defense. "My mom told me to wait until the wedding. She told me to drug her." Patricia gasped, her hands flying to her face as her own son threw her directly into the line of fire. The federal agents immediately took note of the spontaneous confession. I watched my mother realize that the deep loyalty she had demanded from her children was completely one-sided. Trent would sell her out in a heartbeat if he thought it would shave a single month off his federal prison sentence. "Take him downstairs," the special agent ordered his team. Two agents grabbed Trent by his upper arms and marched him out of the conference room. His pathetic sobs faded down the corporate hallway, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. The sudden departure of his heir finally snapped Richard out of his catatonic state. He blinked rapidly, his chest heaving as the absolute reality of the situation crashed down upon him. He had lost his son to the federal government. He was losing his corporation. But his blinding arrogance refused to let him accept defeat gracefully. He desperately needed to regain control of the narrative. He needed to reassert his dominance in a room where he had just been rendered entirely powerless. Richard frantically scanned the remaining law enforcement officers. He bypassed the federal agents and locked eyes with a senior captain from the local police department who was standing near the doorway. Richard straightened his tie, puffed out his chest, and fully leaned into the ugly systemic prejudice he had relied upon his entire life. Officer Richard barked, his voice dripping with aristocratic entitlement. "You need to arrest that man immediately." He pointed a trembling accusatory finger directly at David. "My wife and I have been held hostage in our own conference room for the past hour. That aggressive black man forced his way into a private family meeting and has been ruthlessly threatening us. He is trying to extort us for millions of dollars. He fabricated these ridiculous charges against my son to steal our family corporation. You need to put him in handcuffs right now before he becomes violent." Patricia, sensing a desperate opportunity to shift the blame, quickly joined the racist charade. She scrambled up from the hardwood floor, wiping her ruined mascara. "Yes," she cried out, her voice shrill and pleading. "He has been terrorizing us. He manipulated my daughter and poisoned my son at the wedding. He is a dangerous thug who wants to destroy our family legacy. Please, officer, you have to protect us from him." I stood beside David, absolutely disgusted, but entirely unsurprised by their behavior. When backed into a corner, they immediately weaponized their wealth and their white privilege, assuming the local police would instantly side with an affluent corporate executive over an African-American man. They fully expected David to be slammed against the wall, searched and humiliated. They wanted him punished for daring to step into their world and dismantle their empire. The local police captain did not move. He did not reach for his handcuffs. He simply looked at Richard with an expression of profound, unvarnished pity. Before the captain could even respond to the absurd allegations, the heavy tread of tactical boots echoed back into the room. The FBI special agent in charge, the man who had just hauled Trent away, stepped back through the mahogany doors. He had handed my brother off to the transport team and returned to finish securing the crime scene. Richard saw the federal agent and immediately pivoted his frantic campaign. Agent Richard demanded, his voice rising in panic. "I am formally pressing charges for extortion and attempted assault against this man. He is a criminal. You need to arrest him immediately. I demand you take him into custody." The special agent completely ignored my father's frantic demands. He walked past Richard, brushing past my parents as if they were entirely invisible. He marched straight toward where David and I were standing. Richard crossed his arms, a victorious, ugly smirk briefly flashing across his face. He genuinely believed his wealth had just commanded the government to eliminate his enemy. The special agent stopped directly in front of David. He did not reach for his weapon. He reached out his right hand. David firmly gripped the agent's hand, pulling him into a brief embrace. "It is good to see you again, counselor," the special agent said, his voice carrying a deep warmth that shattered the silence in the room. "It has been a long time since we ran a task force together down in the Southern District." David offered a rare, genuine smile. "It is good to see you too, Reynolds. I wish the reunion was under better circumstances, but I knew you were the only man I could trust to handle a financial takedown of this magnitude on such short notice." The special agent chuckled, a rich sound that completely demolished my parents' remaining sanity. "Are you kidding me?" the agent replied, holding up a thick folder. "When my office received your encrypted data packet at 4 o'clock this morning, my entire team dropped what they were doing. I have never seen a more flawless, airtight case file in my entire career. You handed us the dark web ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the internal corporate communications wrapped in a neat little bow. You basically did our entire job for us, Mr. Prosecutor. We just had to show up and put the handcuffs on the target." Richard staggered backward, his legs giving out completely. He collapsed into a leather chair. The triumphant smirk was wiped from his face, replaced by a gaping expression of pure devastation. He finally understood the true identity of the man he had been insulting. David was not just a corporate lawyer. He was a heavily connected former federal prosecutor who commanded the absolute respect of the United States government. Richard had tried to weaponize the police against a man who used to direct federal law enforcement agencies. Patricia let out a pathetic whimpering sound, clutching her diamond necklace as she stared at David with terror. The immense, undeniable power dynamic had just violently shifted. The man she called an aggressive thug was currently laughing with the federal agent commanding the raid. They had brought their petty country club arrogance to a federal battlefield, and they had been utterly obliterated. The realization that they were entirely powerless against David completely crushed whatever microscopic fight they had left in their souls. Special Agent Reynolds turned his attention away from David and signaled the remaining officers in the room to initiate the secondary phase of their operation. 2 federal agents immediately stepped forward, unfurling a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy official paper. They marched directly toward my parents. Richard watched them approach with hollow, unblinking eyes, while Patricia shrank back against the leather upholstery of her chair. Richard and Patricia Agent Reynolds announced, his voice projecting absolute authority across the boardroom. Based on the digital evidence provided this morning, including your own internal email communications, a federal judge has authorized immediate asset seizure warrants for your entire personal and corporate portfolio. You are officially named as co-conspirators in an ongoing federal investigation into international money laundering, wire fraud, and extortion. Richard let out a strangled gasp, his hands clutching his chest. "You cannot seize my assets," he stammered, his voice cracking under the immense weight of the federal decree. "I did not steal the money from the trust fund. My son acted alone. We just found out about the deficit today. You have absolutely no legal right to confiscate my personal property." Reynolds did not even blink at the pathetic attempt to shift the blame. "Ignorance is not a defense when your own private emails explicitly detail a conspiracy to cover up a felony," the agent replied coldly. "You actively conspired to hide an $8 million deficit from federal auditors. You knowingly allowed stolen capital to fund your corporate operations. Under federal racketeering statutes, every single asset purchased, maintained, or associated with those laundered funds is subject to immediate federal forfeiture." Agents began moving methodically throughout the executive suite. They placed bright red evidence tape over the desktop computers, seized the corporate filing cabinets, and began tagging the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. One agent approached Richard and smoothly confiscated his solid gold wristwatch and the mobile phone resting on the table. Patricia watched the confiscation in absolute horror. She stood up on shaky legs, her hands trembling as she looked at the federal agent. "What exactly does asset forfeiture mean for us?" she asked, her voice a fragile, terrified whisper. "What are you taking from us right now?" David stepped forward, answering the question with the surgical precision of a seasoned prosecutor. "They are taking absolutely everything, Patricia. The federal warrants cover the corporate banking accounts, your private offshore reserves, and your investment portfolios. Furthermore, since the stolen trust fund money was used to pay the property taxes and maintenance fees on your primary residence, your sprawling estate is now property of the United States government. The luxury cars sitting in your garage are being towed as we speak. You have exactly $0 to your name, and you are officially locked out of your own home." The reality of her complete financial annihilation struck Patricia like a physical blow. The mansion, the luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobe, the country club memberships, all the superficial armor she had used to protect her fragile ego and demean others, was entirely gone. She was instantly reduced to absolute poverty. The social standing she valued above her own daughter's sanity had evaporated in a matter of seconds. When her high society friends saw the evening news, she would become an absolute pariah. No one in her elite circle would ever answer her phone calls again. The sheer magnitude of the devastation finally shattered the last remaining fragments of her composure. She turned her wild, tear-filled eyes toward me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You did this!" Patricia screamed, her voice tearing through the conference room like shattered glass. She lunged forward, though an agent quickly stepped into her path to hold her back. "You ruined this family. We gave you a privileged life. We clothed you, we fed you, and we introduced you to high society. And this is how you repay us. You are a vindictive, ungrateful monster. You destroyed your brother. You destroyed our business. You took away my home. You orchestrated this entire nightmare just to punish us because you were always jealous of Trent. You ruined everything." I stood perfectly still, letting her toxic accusations wash over me without absorbing a single drop of her poison. I did not feel an ounce of anger or sorrow. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire existence trying to make me feel small, and I felt nothing but profound, absolute liberation. I stepped around the federal agent, closing the distance until I was standing just a few feet away from my mother. I looked directly into her frantic, weeping eyes. "I did not ruin this family," I said, my voice echoing with a calm, icy finality that silenced her hysterical screaming. "You ruined yourselves. You built an empire on lies, arrogance, and fraud. You raised a son who thought he was entirely above the law and you enabled his worst impulses because you cared more about his appearance than his character. You handed him the matches and he burned your legacy to the ground. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but I cut her off, my tone dropping to a sharp, lethal register. And as for me being ungrateful, I continued, never breaking eye contact. You should be exceptionally grateful that I am standing here today. Because if I had actually drank that poisoned champagne at my wedding, if I had let you lock me inside a psychiatric ward and steal my corporate shares, you would still be facing the exact same federal audit in 14 days. The only difference is that you would have destroyed my life along with your own. Instead, you got a relentless forensic accountant who knew exactly how to track your crimes, and a former federal prosecutor who knew exactly how to ensure you face the absolute maximum prison sentence. I will never apologize for surviving the absolute destruction that you deliberately engineered today. I turned away from my mother for the final time, walking back to David as the federal agents escorted my parents out of the glass conference room. They were not placed in handcuffs like Trent, but they were legally barred from ever stepping foot inside that building again. We watched through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Richard and Patricia were marched out onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk, stripped of their corporate access, their dignity, and their entire financial empire. The heavy mahogany doors of the law firm closed firmly behind them, shutting them out of the privileged world they had valued above their own flesh and blood. 8 months later, we sat in the polished wooden gallery of a federal courtroom, watching the justice system finalize the destruction they had brought upon themselves. Trent stood before a federal judge wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit that completely drained him of his former arrogance. He wept openly during his sentencing, begging for leniency and blaming the intense pressure of his upbringing. The judge remained entirely unmoved by his pathetic display. Trent was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and attempted aggravated assault with a chemical agent. Because federal sentences require inmates to serve at least 85% of their time, my brother would be an old, broken man by the time he ever saw the outside of a prison wall again. The fallout for my parents was equally absolute and entirely devoid of any mercy. The federal asset forfeiture completely wiped out their existence. The government seized the sprawling estate, the luxury vehicles, the offshore accounts, and the corporate holdings. Richard and Patricia were forced to declare total bankruptcy. Stripped of their wealth, they became instant pariahs in their elite social circles. The country club revoked their membership, and their wealthy friends immediately blocked their phone numbers, refusing to be associated with convicted money launderers. They eventually relocated to a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, living entirely on a fixed minimal income. I heard through former acquaintances that Richard spent his days sitting in a worn armchair, staring blankly at a small television, unable to comprehend how his mighty empire had simply vanished. Patricia attempted to secure a job at a high-end retail boutique, but the manager recognized her from the evening news and immediately turned her away. They were completely isolated, trapped in a tiny space with nothing but their bitter regrets and the undeniable reality that they had engineered their own catastrophic downfall. They had chosen to protect a thief, and it cost them absolutely everything they held dear. While they sat in their dark, cramped apartment, David and I were half a world away, surrounded by the crystal-clear turquoise waters of the Maldives. We took a delayed, highly necessary honeymoon, spending 3 glorious weeks disconnected from the chaos of corporate audits and federal indictments. We drank champagne on the deck of a private overwater bungalow, watching the vibrant, glowing sunsets paint the beautiful horizon. The heavy, suffocating anxiety that had mercilessly plagued my entire life was now entirely gone. For the first time, I felt an overwhelming sense of pure, profound, untethered peace. David held my hand as we walked along the white sand beaches, our marriage forged in the intense fire of that chaotic wedding day and hardened into an unbreakable, lifelong bond. He proved exactly who he was when the walls closed in a brilliant, fiercely loyal protector who would gladly burn the world down to keep me completely safe. When we finally returned to New York, I was ready to build my own legacy on my own terms. I took the capital I had safely secured long before the corporate collapse and officially launched my own independent forensic accounting firm. I leased a beautiful modern office space overlooking the city skyline. But my firm was not designed to help massive corporations hide their wealth. I dedicated my practice exclusively to investigating financial family abuse. I took on clients who were being manipulated, extorted, or robbed by their own relatives. I used my specialized skills to untangle hidden trust funds, expose secret offshore accounts, and provide victims with the exact financial ammunition they needed to escape their toxic families. Every time I handed a client the irrefutable evidence they needed to reclaim their freedom, I felt a deep, resonant sense of justice. I took the intense pain and the horrific betrayal I had experienced and weaponized it into a tool for survival and empowerment. My parents had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a disappointment, a mere background character in the magnificent story of Trent. They failed spectacularly. In their desperate attempt to destroy me, they accidentally gave me the exact motivation I needed to become undeniably powerful. I did not just survive the fire they set. I emerged from the ashes and built an absolute fortress. Family is supposed to be your safest harbor, but sometimes it is the very storm you need to escape. Blood does not automatically grant someone the right to manipulate your mind, steal your future, or demand your unquestioning loyalty. The most courageous thing you can ever do is look at the people who share your last name and decide that you truly deserve infinitely better than their conditional love. Has there ever been a moment in your own life where you realized the person trying the hardest to tear you down was actually a member of your own family? Have you ever had to draw an absolute uncrossable boundary to protect your sanity and your future from the people who claim to love you the most? Do not ever feel guilty for cutting off the dead branches so you can finally grow. Please share your story in the comments below and let us remind each other that the family we choose is always stronger than the family we leave behind. Reflecting on Naomi's harrowing journey, the most profound lesson illuminated is the absolute necessity of dismantling the toxic myth of unconditional family loyalty. For far too long, society has pushed the dangerous narrative that blood relations demand endless forgiveness, even in the face of profound, calculated betrayal. Naomi's story spectacularly obliterates this expectation. Her parents and brother used the concept of family not as a sanctuary of love, but as a ruthless weapon for extortion, manipulation, and financial theft. They expected her to absorb their crimes and even sacrifice her own sanity simply because they shared the same DNA. However, Naomi teaches us that true strength lies in recognizing when a familial relationship has become a dangerous parasite. She did not merely survive their abuse, she meticulously drew an uncrossable boundary. By refusing to let her mother weaponize maternal love to escape legal accountability, Naomi proved that protecting your peace sometimes requires walking away from the very people who brought you into the world. Setting boundaries with toxic relatives is never an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation, self-respect, and personal justice. It requires immense, undeniable courage to look at the people who are supposed to be your safest harbor and realize they are actually the destructive storm you must escape. We are completely allowed to curate our own lives and choose the people who genuinely support our growth, rather than those who seek to tear us down for their own selfish gain. True healing begins the exact moment we stop accepting abuse disguised as familial duty, recognizing that loyalty must be earned, not blindly inherited. Please share in the comments below if you have ever had to set a difficult boundary with a toxic family member to protect your own peace.